the Toronto Star. I'm Rajiv Mudder, and this matters. Any way that you look at it, the numbers are stark and sobering. Gun violence in the GTA is up and growing at alarming rates. Last year, 284 people were injured and killed in 492 shootings, which is almost 3 times as many people affected by gun violence in 2014. That's a 300% increase in 5 years. This year, we remain on that record pace, with shootings having injured nearly 100 people and killed 24. And the scary thing is that perpetrators and victims are both getting younger. It is also happening across the GTA, with York and Peel regions also showing similar types of exponential growth in shooting incidents. Joining us today is Wendy Gillis, who covers crime and policing for The Star. She's here to discuss these disturbing numbers that show how gun violence is rising in the city and what might be done about it. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Raju.
Wendy, I think that the really surprising thing here is that while most of us have been isolating, gun crime has not. Can you tell us where we are in terms of the numbers this year?
Yeah, and that is one of the most surprising things because in lots of ways, the pandemic, at least initially, we saw quite an interesting change when it comes to crime. We saw certain types of crime go down, we saw certain types of crime go up, and gun violence has just kind of stayed steady. Interestingly, I just checked, but March, when we all know COVID-19 was declared a pandemic and we all went into isolation, that so far this year saw the highest number of shootings. I think July will surpass it. You know, we still have a few more days and it's very close, but to me, seeing March was a surprise. So yes, certainly it speaks to a lot of different things. I mean, crime does not respect, government orders to stay inside your home, but certainly it says something when shootings are up even higher than normal in a month when everybody was kind of just sitting at home. So there's all kinds of theories about that. We can definitely get into why that might be occurring, but for sure, it's surprising and it's troubling.
I think the thing is right now we're on pace to surpass last year. I think that this is part of a larger overall trend that really is showing no signs of abating. I mean, I think if I read it correctly in your piece, shootings and victims have nearly tripled from 2014 to 2019. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's what's scary. And here's the thing, I've been covering crime for a long time. One thing that we know is that we don't want to take statistics in isolation. So you don't want to necessarily look like, okay, last year was higher or lower than this year. Like that is interesting and we should pay attention to it. But to me, what I think is really troubling, as you mentioned, is sort of this longer view from 2014. That year, we saw 177 shootings. We saw 103 people either killed or injured in shootings. And then fast forward to 2019, when it was, unfortunately, a record-breaking year in the city for shootings, there were 492 shootings and 284 people who were shot, injured or killed in shootings. So that is quite significant. It's over a relatively short period of time. And as you look at kind of annually, it is creeping up. You're seeing it kind of gradually go up. So where we are this year, Toronto Police, they actually have quite an interesting, good sort of data analytics webpage if anyone's ever interested in tracking. They do update it every Sunday. So we have the latest statistics. And as of right now, 111 people have been shot in Toronto, injured or killed in shootings. We have 24 people who have died so far this year. There was a very serious shooting over the weekend where 2 people were shot. And so, that number could go up, unfortunately. And we're at 244 shootings overall this year, which is the highest we've seen since 2015. So that's a lot of numbers. So suffice it to say, things aren't looking good. There is a long-established problem in this city with shootings. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this story was to just sort of level with, with politicians, with police, with community advocates and activists who are working and saying like, look, we have a problem here and let's look at the various ways that we're trying to solve it because apparently it's not working.
We have to be very clear also. This is not just a Toronto problem. This is really spreading across the GTA, right?
Yeah, and so that has kind of come about. One of the reasons why we wanted to kind of look at this issue is because there was in January, a meeting of all of these kind of mayors in all GTA cities, regional chairs, police chiefs, federal and provincial representatives that all came together in January to sort of put their heads together and say, what are we looking at here? We all have a problem. Obviously, crime isn't going to respect these jurisdictional barriers, but the problem has usually sort of focused more in Toronto. But when you start to look at kind of the suburbs, you can see that it's increasing. I personally was shocked. I reached out to Peel Regional Police this week to get the latest numbers from them. And their shootings have gone up substantially in the last 5 years. We're looking at, in 2014, they had 30 shootings and 2 people who were fatally shot. In 2019, they had 92 shootings and 12 people who were fatally shot. That's big. They're still, relatively small numbers, but that's quite an increase in, again, a relatively short period of time. York, too. York saw a 500% increase over the same period, 2014 to 2019. So it's growing everywhere.
I'm flabbergasted by these numbers. 30 and 90, that's 3 times, right? This is over 5 years. It's growing everywhere. This is really scary when you look at these numbers. And I think that the other thing that we have to talk about is that a lot of the victims and the perpetrators are getting younger.
Yeah, that was another takeaway from that January meeting. I think they all got together and kind of discussed who was involved and realized that it's getting younger and younger. It's really sad. I want to acknowledge from the outset that, anyone dying in a shooting is tragic. Doesn't matter how old you are, but it is really sad when you're hearing about someone who is 15, 16, who is shot and killed, and someone who is the same age who is charged. We had a really high profile case of that at the start of this year. A young boy named Safiullah Khosrawi was walking home from school, Scarborough's Woburn Collegiate. He was 15 and he was killed, and a 15-year-old was charged in his murder. I wrote about a young man named Jeremiah Ranger a few months ago who had just turned 15. I talked to his mom shortly after. It was really awful. These are interviews you never, ever want to do. And it's just as tragic in lots of ways when someone just as young is charged because they're still children, right? So that just blows up so many people's lives. And so you have to do whatever you can to stop that from happening.
One of the things I loved about this great piece that you and our coworkers did is that you guys did start looking at solutions. I mean, I think very fair to say that what we're doing is not working, but what are the things that we should be doing?
This is like a Pulitzer Prize winning question, I think, in some ways. I'm stealing that from, there was a town hall meeting a couple of weeks ago before the Toronto Police Board where one of the deputies said that, because I think it kind of speaks to, the complexity of this issue and issues of policing that we're talking about right now. So there's kind of a range of potential solutions. We're talking about, on one end, it's like, the law and order, cracking down on the people who are doing the shootings, making sure they're not getting out of jail, making sure guns don't make it over the border. And then on the other side, we're talking about upstream solutions. So these are the kind of initiatives where you invest in communities, you invest in young people who are maybe at risk of joining a gang or getting involved in criminality, and you intervene before that happens. And I think what we're seeing and what we have long been talking about is, where does the limited amount of funding that we get from the government, where does that go? Is that better spent in these kinds of enforcement, like policing, let's crack down, or do we put it into the longer term upstream solutions? I think you'll find that most people agree there should be a mix of both, but how much is appropriate for one or the other? And I know that, when we look at what we've been doing in the last few years, certainly the emphasis has, in Toronto anyway, there has been a larger emphasis on putting money directly into policing.
I think one of the things we talked about is that you wanted this to be an accountability story. 5 years in, this is one of those things, it's not a new problem. There's been plenty of money already pledged by levels of government that just hasn't been handed over. Is that right? I think there was $250 million that was supposed to be coming from the feds that just hasn't been handed over to Toronto. It's clearly urgently needed. What is going on with that?
Yeah. So I want to be clear that government has provided a fair amount of money. There still is money from the province. There's money from the federal government that has come. They have given $327 million over 5 years. But specifically, when the Liberals were running for re-election in 2018, they announced this $250 million over 5 years that was going to be going towards gun violence. And it was kind of like an acknowledgement that I would argue, and I think many would argue, that what is being provided already is clearly not sufficient. And so this $50 million, that's the first sort of allotment of that $250 million. I've been checking in on that semi-regularly because other levels of government, especially Mayor John Tory, has referenced kind of the real urgency of getting money from the province, from the feds, saying that basically like tax dollars weren't necessarily supposed to be used entirely for this kind of initiative. And the federal representative at that January mayor's meeting talked about that 50 million coming. So there has been a rather large global incident that happened in those intervening months. There's money going towards fighting COVID-19 and that kind of thing, but you will find a lot of community advocates who say, hey, we also have another very serious public health issue and it needs to be addressed. So I think there's a lot of frustration and a lot of concern that attention and crucially money has been devoted towards COVID-19 when, there does need to be funding that goes towards fighting this issue as well, which clearly has not been impacted by COVID-19.
I thought it was a bit strange, but you guys talked about bail in the piece and also mentioned that the mayors were talking about electronic bail bracelets. Are reoffenders a really big problem? You also mentioned that there were some changes to the system. So can you explain those a little bit and whether they've been effective at all?
This was talked about a lot kind of last year. The police chief and Mayor John Tory started discussing challenges of bail, which is, they were saying that when offenders, alleged criminals, were being arrested and charged with firearm-related offenses, they were getting bail and then reoffending. An issue that we ran into was there's a lack of data in general to really understand in fine detail what that picture looks like. Is that accurate? When they're being rearrested, are they being rearrested on firearms charges? Like, the picture is not clear. And that's still a problem. We've written about how there is a dearth of data and it is mitigating us from really diagnosing this problem. What we do know is that provincially in 2018, 39% of cases that involved firearms charges resulted in that person being detained. So that's, roughly 40% of people who were alleged to have been carrying a gun or using a gun or facing a firearms charge, they were kept in jail. Another 30% were released at the bail stage. And then some of them were released kind of from the police station. So we know that there were people who were being released. So the ministry created these teams, and what they say is they're able to sort of bring forward the best case to argue for, for example, why someone who is facing a firearms charge should be kept. And so they told me that their Toronto bail team conducted 716 bail hearings and 92 bail review hearings. So a bail review is exactly what it sounds like. It's when someone is either released or detained and either party wants to say, actually, that's not the right call, and so they review bail. Whether this has worked, I think remains to be seen. I directly asked the outgoing Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders in an interview last week if this was still an issue, and he said, yeah, he still thinks that we're seeing, shootings in the city in part because of issues connected to bail. One thing he did say, though, is that he's hopeful that there could be a change because of this sort of project that's starting up with these electronic bracelets. So basically, it's monitoring to help someone who's out on bail, stay where they're supposed to be and not go out and allegedly, reoffend. One problem that had been identified with this kind of bail bracelet was that the onus was on the accused to pay for that. And because of that, there wasn't a lot of uptake. I don't think if someone who's staring down legal fees and they have financial issues to begin with isn't going to fork out some of their own money to allow the government to monitor them better, right? So that has been changed apparently, and the government is now going to foot the bill. So, we'll see what kind of impact that has. I think, no one's saying that that's kind of the solution here, but potentially that could help someone who's out on bail stay to their conditions.
Okay, I just got to say, that sounds like a pay-as-you-go bail bracelet. That just sounds crazy to me, but okay. The other one, I know it's a big one. It's gun control.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's been a lot of talk, particularly after the Nova Scotia shooting. Mm-hmm. The big one that's been talked about is a handgun ban. Of course, we've talked about it before. I mean, criminals are not respecting the pandemic or, jurisdictional rules. I doubt that they will respect a handgun ban, but obviously, I think these type of laws are important to have.
Yeah.
Any progress on that?
Yeah. So when we talk about, handgun bans, I think we talk too about the border, because these issues are sort of one and the same. It's like, okay, so guns are in our country. How do we either get rid of them or restrict their use? And so a handgun ban has been called for a long time. as you mentioned, there is new gun control legislation that came as a result of the Nova Scotia tragedy in April. And that was definitely supported by people who are calling for a handgun ban, saying that it's a really good step forward, but what we really need is a handgun ban. That has been discussed for several years. I know that the latest from the federal government is that, they will allow for municipalities to make their own sort of rules within their own jurisdictions about the storage of handguns, which would effectively allow cities to ban handguns. Now, that's been criticized as saying that's going to just sort of create this patchwork where, you drive into Toronto, you can't have a handgun, but you drive out to York or Peel and you can. The other major criticism is that we know in recent years anyway, in crimes where a handgun has been used and where police have been able to source the gun, so that means been able to identify where it came from initially, typically it has come from the United States, so smuggled over the border. So that's why I say we need to talk about the border issue when we talk about handgun bans. And so, there are a lot of critics who say it won't really do much good to create a handgun ban, which would cost a lot of money, by the way, when we know that the majority of handguns that are used in crimes don't even really come from legal owners. So would it really make a dent in the shootings that we're seeing? Certainly critics say that it wouldn't. I think the other side of the coin is like, well, why don't we try this? Let's see what happens and let's see if it does help decrease shootings. It's such a big debate. I get a lot of email when I write about gun control. Let's put it that way.
I bet. I think the other one that we talked about a little bit, though, is the idea about community programs in underserved areas that might divert youth. I think this pandemic has obviously exacerbated the cracks in society, but this feels like something that all levels of government are talking about. Just movement seems really slow. Is there more of a sense of urgency right now to try and open these things?
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, too, is that I think the conversation that we're having about shootings and gun violence is becoming more intertwined with the conversations that's happening right now around anti-Black racism, police use of force, and police funding. And I say that because, for example, we just saw this motion in Toronto that went to City Council at the end of June calling for, 10% reduction in police budget. And that 10%, could have gone to something else, such as community funding, community investments. And there is a lot of research, academic-backed research that talks about how investing in communities and putting money, like I keep saying, upstream, preventing crime from happening in the first place does pay dividends. So, it's a longer-term solution, but it could really result in crime reduction over the medium term. And so that's why I say, we're having these big discussions right now about where our limited resources go to, and do we want them going directly to policing, or do we want them to go more towards, communities and stopping crime from happening? For sure, for as long as I've been covering this, there's been a lot of discussion about let's put more money into community programming. There are so many smart, dedicated people who work in this realm, who are on the ground, who see the problems and who know that they can identify individuals or families who could really benefit from some mentorship, from some counseling, from more community supports, more education, that kind of thing. And without that, they're falling through the cracks. I've spoken for sure with a few community advocates who talk about the impact of the pandemic, and specifically the closure of some of the programs, whether it's mentorship programs or even just spaces where youth can go. The closure of that has impacted youth in their lives and potentially contributed to some of the shootings that we're seeing. We don't have data to back that up, but that's certainly coming from people who are on the ground and can speak to this with authority. So it's a really complicated issue for sure, but there are a lot of smart people who look into this. They spend their lives looking at what could work, and it really suggests that there needs to be additional funding that goes towards these kinds of groups, and the kind of funding that is longer term. So, not just a year or two grant or whatever that can allow a group to get off the ground and start making connections and start making the kinds of moves that can implicate or, really make an influence on someone's life, and then they lose their funding and they have to start again.
This is a very important story. The numbers are very troubling, so I really do hope that we find those solutions. I want to thank you so much for your time and for your important work.
Oh, thanks so much, Reggie. I'm happy to talk about it.
Wendy Gillis is a Toronto-based reporter covering crime and policing for The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajan Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.